The Voynich Manuscript is often called the most mysterious manuscript in the world, and it's held on to that title for over a century now. From famous World War codebreakers to an army of modern-day enthusiasts, many have tried hard to find meaning in its text, and just as many have failed. The current situation of the manuscript is still one of many frustrating unknowns. We don't know who created it, why they wrote it, if the text means anything. We can't even agree on what the so-called nymphs are, or if the botanical drawings are meant to represent real plants. These uncertainties, this enduring situation of not knowing, lead some to question the authenticity of the manuscript. Already in 1978, Mary D'Imperio wrote of the uncomfortable suspicion that the mysterious codex upon which so much fruitless effort had been spent might be a fabrication. Could it be a forgery, a hoax, or a fake? In this video, we'll explore what science has to say about the true nature of the Voynich manuscript. First, though, we must understand what people mean when they call the manuscript fake. In the comments on my previous video alone, all these people suggested that some form of falseness or deceit must be part of the solution, but they weren't all talking about the same thing. Having seen many similar statements over the years, I feel it's helpful to split the issue into 3 questions. Is the text fake? Did the makers have bad intentions? And is the artifact itself fake? All of these are different and can occur in all combinations. Let's start with the first one. What if the Voynich text is meaningless? Is that alone sufficient to speak of a fake? The manuscript certainly looks like it should contain information. Its pages are filled with paragraphs consisting of words made up of letters. If it turned out that these don't mean anything, then this could be seen as a form of deceit. There are actually plenty of examples of a practice like this in medieval art, although usually just a single line of text, not thousands of them. What you're seeing here might look like Hebrew or Arabic to the untrained eye, but looks can be deceiving. You might recognize a real letter from the Hebrew alphabet here and there, but the overall text is nonsense, and many of the symbols are invented. These are examples of what we call pseudo-Hebrew and pseudo-Kufic, after a particularly decorative type of Arabic script. They are mostly meaningless imitations, meant to impart some Middle Eastern flavor to the subject. The text is fake, yet nobody would call the artworks themselves fake. We also wouldn't call Jan van Scorel a fraud or a forger just for imitating some Hebrew on Mary Magdalene's dress. By the 16th century, pseudoscript was so well known that it was even parodied. Renowned art historian Alexander Nagel discusses an example in a 1502 painting by Andrea Mantegna. Generations of scholars have interpreted this text as pseudo-Greek because it vaguely looks like Greek, but especially because it appears in a place where we would expect Greek. As it turns out, though, this is simply Latin with a lot of flourishes. Nagel writes how Mantegna had an interest in frontier between ornament and script. His contribution to the discussion is the playfully disguised text on the scroll, where a perfectly legible script hides in plain sight under a thin veil of ornament. It is a pseudo-pseudoscript, a commentary on a now centuries-old tradition of pseudoscript in art. The trick he plays on his viewers serves as a demonstration of how easily a real message can be camouflaged by ornament. The main issue with this first question, though, is that at the moment we have no way of telling whether the Voynich text contains any information. Discussions about the text's meaning or lack thereof are useful as long as they are based on evidence. Since no one has been able to build a convincing case for either of these solutions so far, all we can do is speculate. Any theory based on the supposed meaning or lack of meaning in the text is at this point a fantasy. Now, to be fair, if I say the Voynich manuscript is fake, most people will picture a more malicious scenario, like that of the medieval hoax. This question is separate from that of meaning, since it's entirely about the maker's intentions. One can engage in an activity called asemic writing, like Luigi Serafini did in his Codex Seraphinianus. In a 2007 phone interview for El País, Serafini described the Codex as water that gushed out of him. Now, I've always said that comparing the Codex Seraphinianus to the Voynich Manuscript is fraught with issues, but examples like these show why it's helpful to disconnect the notions of meaning and intention. The Voynich Manuscript can be meaningless without being, to use the words of a presumably younger commenter, a giant boast. Just like with meaning, though, we haven't advanced far enough yet in our study of the manuscript to draw any conclusions whatsoever about the intentions of its makers. Say that a random guy wrote the manuscript 600 years ago. We can't exactly travel back in time to spy on him, so until we find some author statement in the text, all claims about maker's intentions belong in the realm of speculation. This leaves us with the third question, which is the main topic of this video. Is the artifact itself fake? Is the Voynich manuscript pretending to be a genuine medieval codex, while in fact it was produced much later? The current scholarly consensus is that the manuscript first entered the historical record around the turn of the 17th century in the entourage of Rudolf II. And indeed, the world's most mysterious manuscript could not have chosen a better environment to surface than Rudolphine Prague. Once described as the greatest art patron in the world, this emperor attracted all kinds of artists and scientists to his court. Rudolf was also known as an avid collector, and his interests included rare books. If you're new to the Voynich manuscript and you just learned about the fact that it first surfaced in this particular context, I wouldn't blame you for wondering, what if some skilled con man, aware of the emperor's willingness to pay for medieval manuscripts, just decided to produce one? This was the view of Robert Brembaugh, who claimed that none other than John Dee manufactured the thing just to get his hands on a considerable part of Rudolph's book budget. It's interesting that Brembaugh also proposed a decryption of the text, so for him the suspicion of deceit did not exclude the presence of meaning. The idea that someone made this to defraud Rudolph doesn't sound too bad at first glance, but we'll have a second glance in a moment. First, though, why stop at the 17th century? In our final scenario, the year is 1910, and the perpetrator none other than Wilfrid Voynich himself. Voynich was active in the booming international manuscript trade, which moved thousands of medieval manuscripts and early printed books into collections of the super rich around the world. So just like in Rudolph's time, there was a market and a potential motive. This modern forgery theory is primarily associated with the work of Richard Santa Coloma, who went through a range of different theories before settling on the idea that Wilfrid created it as a hoax. We'll get back to this at the end of the video. For now, we will condense the issue to the following question. Is the Voynich manuscript a genuine medieval artifact, or was it just made to look like one by someone who lived later? Like this, we don't have to speculate about the meaningfulness of the text or the specific motivations of the makers. So, how do you date a manuscript? Scholars use a whole range of factors to determine when a document was written. Some are more useful than others, depending on the particular circumstances of the manuscript in question. If you're lucky, you can use internal dates. A scribe might mention the year when a manuscript was commissioned, when it was finished, when a legal document was drafted, refer to current events, and so on. As far as we know, there's no legible date in the Voynich. And to be fair, the presence of a date wouldn't do much to change skeptical minds. A suspected fraudster can easily add any date they want. So this one is out. Some manuscripts come with a very detailed provenance, down to the workshop where they were made. As I mentioned before, though, the first time we hear about the Voynich is in the 17th century, which is not sufficient to take it all the way back to the Middle Ages. So we can't use this either. Before you write a comment about how suspicious this is, keep in mind that we know next to nothing about the exact origin of most manuscripts sitting in libraries' archives. So the fact that we can't trace it back to a specific medieval scriptorium is what we would generally expect. Part of a manuscript's history being unknown is the rule, rather than the exception. Next, there's radiocarbon dating. Developed in the late 1940s, this technique determines the age of organic materials. The Voynich is written on vellum, a fine type of parchment made of calf skin. Since bovine skin is quite literally an organic material, we can use radiocarbon dating to determine its age, technically the moment when the calves were slaughtered. In 2009, the University of Arizona subjected several fragments of the manuscript to carbon dating. They concluded that the vellum was prepared between 1404 and 1438, with a probability of 95%, which is about as close to absolutely certain you can get. Furthermore, a narrower date range between 1411 and 1430 can be presumed with still 68% certainty. Let's add that to our timeline like this. The results of the radiocarbon dating are trusted by all Voynich scholars I know of. One of the reasons for this remarkably broad acceptance is that the technique is reliable, reducing the date range to just a few decades. Moreover, you still don't have to abandon your theory of a John Dee or Wilfrid Voynich authorship. You can just say that the later forger found some old parchment lying around. Keep in mind though that vellum wasn't cheap and usually custom ordered for specific projects. Finding a stack of unused 15th century vellum is kind of like finding an unused vintage car. It's technically possible and probably happens sometimes, but it's probably a bit of a stretch if your entire theory depends on this happening. Unfortunately, carbon dating does not work for the inks and pigments used in the manuscript, since they don't have sufficient amounts of organic materials. What you can do is examine their composition. We know how inks and paints were made in the Middle Ages, and we also know when more advanced ingredients were invented. So if you're examining a medieval painting and you find substances in the paint that were only synthesized in the 20th century, you know you're likely dealing with a fake. A famous example is the Finland map, now understood to be a 20th century forgery. It first appeared in 1957 and was claimed to be a 15th century Mappa Mundi, with information about Viking visits to North America. The whole thing looked suspicious from the start, and initial opinions were divided. In 1972, the map was sent for chemical analysis to the team of forensic specialists Walter McCrone. Remember that name. They concluded that the ink was not of medieval origin. It contained a specific form of titanium dioxide, which we only started producing in the late 1800s and using in pigments since the 1920s. If you've ever painted yourself or watched the Bob Ross video during the pandemic, you may have heard of titanium white, which is named precisely after this ingredient. Today, titanium dioxide is the most commonly used pigment in white paints. If you find it in a paint sample, the paint is modern. In 2009, McCrone took samples of ink and various paints from the Voynich manuscript. The ink turned out to be iron gall ink, also known as common ink or standard ink. It was the go-to option between the 5th and 19th century and remained popular later as well. So the only thing this tells us is that the ink is compatible with the 15th century, lacking any suspicious modern ingredients. The same goes for the pigments, which were all determined to be made of relatively affordable materials widely available to medieval European scribes. For example, the reds in the manuscripts are ochres, naturally occurring earth pigments that were already used in prehistoric cave art. So while identifying these materials used in the ink and pigments hasn't brought us much closer to a solution so far, you can probably see how they paint a completely different picture than the advanced synthetic paint of the Vinland map. Let's move on to our next indicator. When your artifact contains depictions of people, another thing you can do is look at the fashion. Since fashion trends are ever changing, they allow us to approximate the age of an image. Even without much experience, you can probably match these pictures with the right decade. The illustrations in the Voynich manuscript are mostly plants, but according to a count we did at the Voynich Ninja Forum, it still contains 553 human figures. That should give us some pieces of clothing to work with, right? right? It probably would have been easier if it weren't for the fact that 90% of these so-called nymphs aren't wearing any clothes, apart from ambiguous and generic headgear. Luckily, some of them kept their clothes on. Researchers' attention has mostly been drawn to 3 figures from the Zodiac series: the Virgin, the female twin, and the crossbowman. The women are wearing a loose garment with wide open sleeves. Their edges show evidence of dagging, a decorative technique applied to the edges of garments created by cutting or slashing the fabric. The man wears a blue garment with equally remarkable sleeves. He's also dealing with a fabric surplus, but in his case, the sleeve is narrow at the wrist, creating kind of a bag around the elbow. His hat consists of a wide brim and a long tail. It was details like these that allowed earlier researchers to conclude with confidence that this style is compatible with 15th century Europe. I felt like we could do better though, but it wasn't until 2018 that I realized how to proceed. That's when I first saw the Devonshire hunting tapestries. Now, to be fair, both Ellie Walinska and J.K. Peterson had already written about their relevance for the crossbowman's dress. I was unaware of this earlier research, but it didn't surprise me that the boar and bear hunt had been noticed independently on various occasions. Look at these wide-brimmed hats, the tails hanging to one side, these gloriously baggy sleeves. It's definitely worth a mention. What Peterson and Walinska hadn't noticed, though, is that of the 4 hunting tapestries, just this one had been given an earlier date. I wondered why, and luckily the Victoria and Albert Museum's curators explain their reasoning. In the description for the boar and bear hunt, they write that the men are in bulky garments with large drooping sleeves. Bagpipe sleeves seen in the tapestry went out of fashion around 1430. So I thought, wait a minute, these sleeves are sufficient to force a cutoff point at 1430 for the one tapestry that contains them? It felt like something worth investigating. To avoid selection bias on my part, I went to the Voynich Ninja forum and asked the members to collect depictions of sleeves like the one worn by the crossbowman. I then looked up the given dates for all sources that had one and compiled everything in this graph. The earliest examples appear slightly before the year 1400, limited to specific high-end North Italian workshops. The vast majority of examples we collected were from the first 3 decades of the 15th century. You can find later examples, but it's clear that the trend is already declining in the 1420s and must have been perceived as outdated in the 1430s. Let's have a look at a concrete example. Compare these 2 manuscripts of the Livre de Chasse, a hunting manual written by master huntsman Gaston Phébus. In the original scene, made around 1390, the men have pretty unremarkable sleeves. But see what happens when this exact scene is copied just 17 years later in 1407. That's a different pair of sleeves. I also tried to do something similar for the women's dagged sleeves, but here we found only a few examples where people agreed that they matched the Voynich style closely enough. Interestingly, this limited sample follows the exact same trend as the crossbowman's dress, early attestations just before 1400 in northern Italy, and then a surge in popularity up to 1420. These findings were confirmed when René Zandbergen shared a quote made in 2014 by Roger Week, curator and department head of medieval and Renaissance manuscripts at the Morgan Library in New York. He said that the specific fashion trends found in the Voynich Zodiac section would have been largely unknown in the decades and centuries following the 1420s. Joining everything, we will add fashion to our timeline like this. What else can we use to find when the manuscript was written? How about the actual writing? Medieval handwriting styles vary both by region and over time, which allows paleographers to estimate their origins. We could try to compare Voynichese to other scripts, but that's probably worth a separate video. For now, let's focus on the Latin script found in the very last folio. It was not uncommon for scribes and later owners to use any empty spaces in manuscripts, like the margins and the last page, for various purposes. Think of pen tests, ownership marks, page numbers, additional notes about the text, unrelated notes, doodles, scribbles, and so on. So when you come across such inscriptions, you shouldn't automatically assume that they were left by the author himself. In the case of the Voynich, we knew that the Latin script was compatible with the 15th century, but not much else. This was confirmed by professional paleographer and Voynich researcher Lisa Fagan Davis when I asked her opinion last year. And her reply made me suspect the second half of the 15th century rather than the first. So at this point, my starting hypothesis was that one of the manuscript's early owners wrote these sentences, but probably not one of the original scribes. Sometime last year, I became interested in trying to find out where this text was written. Marco Ponzi, who is much more experienced with medieval handwriting, shared this interest, so we decided to work together. First, we analyzed the shapes of the letters of the Voynich marginalia. For example, L can be written with or without a loop. Another remarkable property of the L shapes on folio 116V is that they are large and often pointy, almost triangular. We then determined such identifying features for all recognizable letters on the page. We ended up working with 33 properties. These were then used to score documents with a known origin. For example, this charter was written in 1493 in Estonia. As you can see, the L's are unlooped. It doesn't do very well for other letters either, scoring just 11 out of 33. So this script is a very poor match. I'm loving these top-line ascenders though. Marco and I spent countless hours analyzing almost 400 manuscripts from different times and places. This research is still unpublished since I would really like to add some more places to the list. Maybe it will be ready by Voynich Manuscript Day in August. I can tell you something about the dates already though. Personally, I was more interested in finding out a location, and the date was more of an afterthought. I just had a vague idea that it was probably later in the 15th century. As our list of documents grew, however, both Marco and I noticed something peculiar. It was much easier to find good matches in the first half of the 15th century than in any other period. And even more to my surprise, most of our really good matches were written in the first quarter of the 15th century. Out of the hundreds of samples, these are our 15 best results. These findings that the script leans closer to the medieval period and that the most similar writers were active in the first quarter of the 15th century led me to reconsider my intuitions about the marginalia. They probably were written by one of the original scribes. Finally, we should consider professional opinion. Early opinions on the manuscript varied quite a bit, which is something Rich Santa Coloma likes to put forward as evidence for the manuscript being fake. And I think I understand why. To the best of our knowledge, it looks like Wilfrid Voynich purchased the manuscript from the Jesuits as part of a larger batch. He seems to have been unaware of what this thing was, and later called it an ugly duckling between those other treasures. For reasons beyond the scope of this video, Voynich then came to believe that the manuscript was by none other than Roger Bacon, a 13th century English polymath. In those early days, the Voynich manuscript was actually known as the Roger Bacon cipher manuscript. On the other hand, though, there was also Brumbaug's theory that John Dee produced the manuscript in the 16th century. Possible dates for the manuscript range from the 13th all the way to the 16th century. And without the help of radiocarbon dating or detailed analysis of the fashion and handwriting, everything in between seems to have been fair game. People of all degrees of qualification offered their opinions, often based on incomplete, grainy, black and white copies of a few folios. It's hard to see the forest through the trees in this 20th century cacophony of opinions, but luckily there's one trail that's often reliable. Talk is cheap, but $250,000 isn't. That's today's equivalent of what Hans-Peter Krauss paid for the manuscript in 1961, when it was finally sold shortly after Ethel Voynich's death. Krauss was no amateur. In fact, he was described as, without doubt, the most successful and dominant rare book dealer in the world. His achievements as a bookseller being on an altogether grander scale than those of Voynich himself. Before spending this much money on a manuscript, though, he would have wanted to know as much as possible about it. Therefore, he relied on the advice of Helmut Lehmann-Haupt. Lehmann-Haupt wasn't just any random guy with an opinion. The son of a history professor, he wrote his own PhD on early book illustration. This provided him with the necessary background in iconography, an essential part of dating manuscripts. After his doctoral studies, he spent time as a rare book dealer and later museum curator in Germany before moving to the United States in 1929. There he first worked as the curator of rare books at Columbia University and taught classes on rare books at various institutions. These activities gave him plenty of hands-on experience with early books and manuscripts. By the time of the Second World War, it's clear that he was already considered a leading expert in his field, being asked to advise the United States military on matters relating to art and cultural treasures. During his career, he published literally hundreds of books on art, rare books, and bibliography, the scientific discipline of describing books. Later in his career, he used all this accumulated expertise in his work as a bibliographical consultant and later chief bibliography expert for H.P. Krauss. We also know that Lehmann-Haupt restored the Voynich manuscript after its purchase, so this man, who professionally handled medieval manuscripts all the time, got to examine the artifact in much more detail than anyone ever before. We don't know exactly what Lehmann-Haupt told Krauss, but we do have this quote from a letter he wrote to John Tiltman in 1962. There was near agreement on the date of the cipher manuscript as around, or a little after, the year 1400. So we have the most experienced assessor of manuscripts at the time, advising one of the greatest book dealers of all time. His opinion? Early 15th century. Today, virtually all specialists agree that the manuscript is authentic. Among them, Lisa Fagin Davis, director of the Medieval Academy of America and Voynich scholar par excellence. During her professional career, Lisa has handled more than 1,000 medieval codices and fragments, and she's had the chance to study the Voynich manuscript up close on at least 10 occasions. It's this kind of expertise that gives her opinion a lot of weight among Voynich researchers. She writes that the simplest and most likely explanation that accounts for all of the physical and historical evidence is that the manuscript is a genuine 15th century object. There is absolutely nothing suspicious about the VMS. This last part is key. Actual fakes are usually long suspected by specialists, with only outliers maintaining that the artifact is genuine. In the case of the Voynich, though, we get exactly the opposite. Specialists agree that nothing about it is suspicious, but still there's this parallel circuit of people insisting that it's fake. It's hard to argue with them, since actually proving something is almost impossible. The best we can do is consider the evidence, which is what I've tried to accomplish here. We've collected quite a number of date ranges over the course of this video. Let's see what happens when we put them all together. We have the range of the radiocarbon dating, in other words, the expected age of the material on which the manuscript is written, first decades of the 15th century. We have a surprisingly precise date of fashion elements in the drawings, first decades of the 15th century. We have the handwriting analysis of the marginalia, first decades of the 15th century. The opinion of Helmut Lehmann-Haupt, the most qualified professional to comment on the manuscript's age before the results of the radiocarbon dating were known, first decades of the 15th century. The opinion of modern-day specialists like Lisa Fagin Davis, you guessed it, early 15th century. This leaves us with two options. The first is that the forger, whether he lived in the 17th or the early 20th century, must have 1. Found a large stack of unused vellum of different sizes. Then decided to make a fake 1420s manuscript which coincidentally matches the age of the vellum. 3. Predicted that precise analysis of inks and pigments would become available in the distant future. 4. Managed to replicate period-appropriate inks and pigments without leaving any trace of modern materials. 5. Known of a short-lived medieval sleeve trend relevant only to the exact period when the vellum was made. 6 not just mimicked medieval handwriting for the marginalia, but do it in such a way that a whole constellation of subtle letter properties turn out to be found most often in the period when the vellum was made. 7 fooled specialists through the ages without leaving a single trace. The second option is that, maybe the manuscript was made in the first decades of the 15th century. So we have either a document that was actually made in the early 1400s, as indicated by all the evidence, or Wilfrid Voynich was the greatest forger the world has ever seen, with a superhuman knowledge of past and future. This towering pile of assumptions becomes even more ridiculous when you realize that Voynich himself was absolutely clueless. He became convinced that the manuscript was made in the 13th century by Roger Bacon, and if not Bacon, then maybe Albertus Magnus, who lived around the same time. So first, Voynich pulled off the most convincing medieval fake of all time, fine-tuning all the aspects to point to the exact same couple of decades, and then he became stubbornly convinced that it was made 200 years earlier. And that is why I, together with the vast majority of Voynich's researchers today, view the manuscript as a genuine medieval artifact made in the early 15th century. I owe a huge thank to Lisa Fagan-Davis, Marco Ponzi, Gary Rappaport and Renee Zandbergen for their input. I am planning to publish a Voynich-themed video about once a month, so consider subscribing if you're interested in that kind of stuff. And then I'll see you next time.